Okay, welcome everybody. As I had a chance to meet some of you as you came in tonight, my name is Kurt Downey. I am the superintendent of the Nashoba Regional School District. Excuse me for a minute. There's a benefit to wearing hearing aids. That when you sync to your phone starts ringing, you can hear nothing else in the room, but you all didn't hear that, but I did. Welcome, thank you for coming out tonight. This is our first of many community presentations that we'll be having over the course of several years as we look forward to the opportunity of refreshing, rebuilding, renewing this building. We are currently working a project with the MassSBA. You're going to learn a lot about that process tonight, so I won't go into detail about it. But this is the first of many conversations that are going to be vitally important in distributing and handing off to our communities throughout this process to fully educate all the citizens of our three towns. This is not a presentation to school district families. This is a presentation for every resident in our three towns. And moving forward, it's going to be that much more important for us to continue to engage the residents of our three towns in this process, ultimately to get to the point of funding construction and opening, whether it's a renovation, whether it's an add-on, whether it's a rebuild through this process. But you'll learn more about that tonight. Some gratitudes here. Joe Gleason, who is our chair of the building committee. Marianne's with Scanspit. Joe and Craig are with CastleVos, our architects. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our OPM, Marianne Williams.
Thank you. I'm going to stand off to the side so I can see this a little bit. To tell you a little bit about Scanspit, I'm here with a couple of colleagues, C and Dale, and they're working on the project with us. Just to tell you a little bit about Scanspit, we are what they call owners, project managers, which means that we represent the school district, and we are like a liaison, so to speak, between the architect, the district, the Mass School Building Authority, and eventually the contractor for the project. For those of you that don't know very much about Scanspit, we're a very large international and national construction company. We have $1.7 billion worth of work that we put in place as owners, project managers. A lot of work with the Mass School Building Authority. We have a lot of experience with the MassSBA and going through this feasibility study process and putting together reliable, durable budgets. And we have our own in-house cost estimating. It's not one person, it's a team. And we were able to bring to the table our experience as builders and developers. And this team is made up of seasoned construction professionals. And we have a lot of experience with new construction and complex occupied phased renovation projects. So we're also leaders in the green building industry, and we hope to bring all of this to the benefit of the communities. Next slide, please. Okay.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm Craig Olson with CastleVos Associates. We're the project architect, the architects for the project. And behind us, we have a whole team of consultants working with us. Sitting to my left right here is Joe Milani, who is the project architect with CastleVos. We also we're a New England firm. We've done specializes in K-12 educational design as well as public safety design. I'm not going to go through a great deal, but we have both landscape, interior designs, and architecture in-house. But in addition to that, we have a whole team of consultants behind us that are experts in their field that we will all work together to make this project successful. Going through this, we have many years of experience with them. But we want to talk quickly just a little bit about our approach. We don't look to build monuments to ourselves as designers. We look to be student-centered, take a very active approach when we do our buildings. It's not, we're designing for the end user. We're not coming in with any predetermined notions of what it should be. It's we're here to listen and then respond to that. And that includes sustainable design, because sustainable design can mean a lot of things to many different people. So it's what the values of the communities and our communities of Nashoba Regional, as it relates to sustainable design, as well as what does innovation mean? It can mean a lot of different things. It's the same thing when you say 21st century education. It can mean a lot of different things. Every school district teaches differently. So we want to make sure we take that into account when we're working on this, that we're working to create the right project for the Nashoba Regional School District. But through that, we've also been very successful in doing that, where we've been very cost effective with our designs. We were the architect that did Minuteman High School, which is part of your district. And we've actually been fortunate enough to work with Scanspit on both Minuteman and at Aurora High School, which are both at or below budget in the past few years. As I mentioned, we're a New England firm. What we've done in the recent years, we've done over 120 schools, 50 of them being high schools in the New England area. And here's an example of just some recent ones that we have done. And from there, I'm going to kind of turn it over to Mary Ann from Scanspit to talk a little bit about the MassSBA process and how we'll be working with them.
So what you'll see here is we talk about the opportunity that the district will have with the Mass School Building Authority. The Mass School Building Authority is a quasi-public agency. And the process that takes place here really is that there's 1,852 schools, K through 12 schools in Massachusetts. And there are between 12 to 15 core projects that the Mass School Building Authority accepts into their program, aside from multiple other smaller projects having to do with window replacement, boilers, roof replacement, etc. So when you look at that comparison, that you may have 200 or 300 schools pursuing through a statement of interest, which identifies all the deficiencies within the building, you see the opportunity that is absolutely incredible, that you're one of those 12 to 15 schools that got selected to go through this rigorous program. So where does the money come from? Well, you'll see that money comes from taxes paid by Bolton, Lancaster, and Stowe, but the money comes from 1 cent of the state sales tax, and that funds the MassSBA school projects. And when you get the opportunity to see your tax dollars at work, it's phenomenal. A lot of times we pay taxes, we have no idea how the money is spent, but this is really an investment in the future of not just your community, but the state. And this program is a model program for other states, and people pay close attention to the success that has been realized through this program. Next slide, please. So what are the initial requirements to receive the grant from the MassSBA? Well, first, you've already completed the first step. You submit a statement of interest that identifies the deficiencies in the building. And then you go through a feasibility study. The feasibility study, in my mind, is probably the most important part of the project. It's confirming our understanding of the school, of the educational program, about what works, what doesn't work. And we're not here to tell you what you need. We're here to do a thorough analysis so that there can be an informed decision made with the community. And it's not us saying this is what you need to do. It's with all the information available, what makes the most sense for your communities. Next slide, please. So what happens with the feasibility study is that we do an existing conditions survey of the building facility. We confirm what works, what doesn't work. We identify where there are issues with code compliance, lack of compliance with energy codes, seismic, accessibility, and it goes on. I'm not going to read them all to you. So we identify the issues with the building, but then we identify, well, how does the condition of the building impact the educational program? And so what that means is, if you have a leaky roof, it's a distraction. And what we don't want is a building that's a distraction to the students, because education is a gift. And to be able to have that take place and have the setting that you're in be transparent and that your retention is not on being cold or poor lighting or poor ventilation, but on the opportunity to learn together. So next slide, please. So when you look at the MassSBA process, you've gone through Module 1, which is the eligibility period. Congratulations, you've been selected. And you've gone through Module 2, which is forming the project team. The district has gone through a very rigorous process with the school building committee and subcommittees in selecting the owner's project manager and the design team in concert with the Mass School Building Authority. So now we're at what they call Module 3. It's a very linear, prescriptive process that the stage is outlined. I encourage you, if it's of interest, to go to the MassSBA website where you'll be able to see what those processes are and what takes place. And so looking at the preliminary design program, we call it Module 3A. What we're doing is we're looking at multiple options to solve what we see as the problems to be addressed. And it also includes looking at multiple sites to determine what is the most appropriate site. What is most appropriate, a renovation addition, or new construction. That's not our determination, but what is our responsibility is to identify options that addresses the educational program and supports the program. And then, what does it cost? What is the schedule? What is the impact of current educational program? So, for example, if you're doing a renovation in an occupied school, we always want to make sure that no matter what the choice is, that the educational program, the current school operations are not interrupted. So once we look at, the what ifs, well, what if we do, option A, B, C, D, E? Could look at up to, half a dozen to a dozen options. We then narrow that down after we make a submission to the Mass School Building Authority and we get the approval that they've deemed that we have done our homework, that we have provided the information and resources so that an informed decision can be made. So then we go on to what they call the preferred schematic. Usually, at that point in time, we say, well, what are the best 3 possible options for us? And then we make we do a deeper analysis of those 3 options as well. And at the completion of that, again, we submit to the Mass School Building Authority to say we've looked at these 3 to 4 options. Our preferred option, preferred schematic, is option X. And the Mass School Building Authority, with their team and resources, will evaluate the work that we've done, the submission. They'll have an independent peer review done by another architectural firm. They'll look at our study, our information, and they'll critique it. They may say, why don't you study this a little more? We're seeing something here that we think you need to explore a little bit more. Well, they may say, oh, we concur with you that this does look like it's the best option given the goals of the district. So then, once that Module 3 is complete and we have approval from the Mass School Building Authority Board, we go into schematic design. And what that means is we have one option and we're going to develop it beyond a conceptual level, and we're going to develop it to a 15 to 25% completion so that there's enough information there so that we can do a thoughtful cost analysis, and that there's enough information there that we can analyze, well, what is the schedule, what is the impact of the program, and begin to make plans for, well, how would we build the project, what are the cost implications, what are the schedule implications, what are the logistics, over what period of time would all of this take place. So once you complete the schematic design, Module 3, Module 4, you have completed your feasibility study and schematic design. And after that point, that's when it then becomes well, it's happening now, but it becomes an ongoing conversation within the community about whether or not to fund this project, whatever that choice is. And that won't be determined until we get to the end of Module 3B for the feasibility study.
Thank you, Marianne. So Marianne just touched at a high level of the process. What we want to do is take it and add another layer onto it as what it relates to your specific project and what timeline and tasks we're doing on this, because it is a process. Nothing has been determined at this time. We're still in the very early phases of doing our due diligence to find out what the right solution or what the preferred solution will be. So right now, if you look at even the timeline, this is where we are. We're in what they're calling the PDP, the Preliminary Design Program Marianne mentioned, where we're evaluating the existing conditions. We are conducting educational visioning, which is not about the building, it's about how education is going to be delivered in Nashoba Regional currently, and what we see it being, or what you see it being delivered in the future, so that we make sure whatever we do accommodates what that's going to be. As well as then evaluating site options. So not only are we looking on the current site, but we're also going to explore other sites around the member communities that fall within the regional district charter, to make sure that, again, that we do our due diligence to make sure that we're giving you all the information as your building committee to make an educated decision of what the right solution is for the project. And as Mary mentioned, we will then develop some preliminary options. In June, we'll be submitting that to the MassSBA for their review and their vet. It's a very linear process, you mentioned, and every project goes through that with them. And they vet it and they provide feedback. We take that, as she mentioned, and add another layer onto it. So we further develop those options. We start talking about building systems, developing the budget, and then evaluating and selecting what that preferred option is. And then in October of this year, we'll be, at the end of October, we'll be submitting, what that preferred solution is selected. That again, as Marianne mentioned, will be vetted by the MassSBA, by a third party, by their facilities assessment subcommittee. And then we're targeting in December of this year to receive approval from the MassSBA to proceed with whatever that preferred solution is into schematic design. Again, we just don't know yet. We're still early in that process. And what that will actually mean is then, as she mentioned, developing that single option so that we can then submit to the state in June of 2023 the schematic design. And that's where we'll start working with the funding and the actual approval of projects Marianne mentioned earlier. So today, we want to just kind of give a snapshot. Collectively, there's been a lot of hours that have been placed in by the district members, the school committee, the school building committee, professionals that are part of your team. And you can see we've kind of checked off items that we've done so far. So we've begun studying the existing conditions. We've conducted the educational visioning. And so these are still tasks to be done. So we're here just to kind of give you information on it. And this won't be the last public forum by far. There'll be multiple as we go through each of these, because we want to make sure that we keep you informed of where we're going, so that you're aware of what's going on. But we also want to get information from you. So this is a forum. While we're talking right now, the floor is going to become yours, and we're here to answer questions and have healthy discussion so that we can learn from you as far as what is important to you, priorities, and information. So it's important as we talk about that, and that actually is going to lead me into just big picture schedule. We're talking about a feasibility study. I kind of reviewed these dates, the schematic design, and project funding agreement. And so these are all very tentative dates, but based on just the current schedule, you can kind of see that if everything goes tentatively, that this is kind of the rough schedule, that it's not a quick decision. It's a very thought out, calculated process that even from now, it would be 6 years really till a building would be a reality for students to occupy it. So we went over just the MassSBA process, and so we have more things to talk about tonight. Again, one of the big items is talking about the existing conditions of what we've seen so far. But we did want to take a pause and give an opportunity to have anybody ask any questions just about what we've covered so far with the MassSBA process, or if there's anything along those lines. So we'll pause if you do have a question.
I'll just say that we set up some microphones here and here for people that feel comfortable speaking to the microphone. But if you can project and ask your question from where you are, you're welcome to do that. I will repeat the question just so that our folks at home who will be watching when this recording goes out can hear the question as well. Or Craig, if you can do the same when the question's asked from your. So in terms of the first portion of the presentation on the timeline and where we are, we'll take questions from the audience.
I'm pretty loud. I've seen it come up in the group in Stowe, and I just wanted to ask, I know you guys put the timeline on there, what would be the sort of ideal or projected timeline? If you could give us an idea of the incoming, who the first incoming freshman would be, what year would they be now? Like our current 7th graders, our current 3rd graders. I think that would help those of us who are parents sort of an idea of, you know,
You nailed it, Kristen. 2nd and 3rd graders, depending on which year.
that was my class.
It's about 6 years from this point to,
That would be the first freshman class.
Just wanted to know, are your plans and your estimates on the costs, are they able to be adjusted for inflation and variable pricing on different materials? Seems it's pretty low in the market right now, and I don't think that we want to, a year from now, we'll have to redo the entire study.
Absolutely. So what we typically do, and we have tremendous resources at Scanspit as well as an independent cost estimator that works with the design team. So it's not just one company doing an estimate, it's 2 companies, they each have their own teams. What we typically do is we go back 10 years and we say, what has escalation been in costs over the last 10 years? What has it been over the last 3 years, and what are the trends going forward? Because when we estimate an option, we're looking at estimating it to the midpoint of construction. So when we talk about putting estimates together, we're going to be projecting out to maybe 2025, 2026 to the midpoint of construction. Given the volatility that's happening in the world, a couple of things that are going on now. And time, I think, is on our side here because we have 2 years before we select the preferred option. But right now, with what's going on with COVID, it wasn't obvious in the beginning about what the impact was. At the time, we had an administration that thought, you know, COVID is something that's, you know, it's like the flu. It's going to be here in a few months and it's going to be gone. Nobody ever thought there were going to be 4 variants and maybe even 5 now, and that it was going to last over a 2-year period. And so what the world is looking at right now is that we're in what we think is the top of the bubble, okay? And so when you're in the top of the bubble, your prices are higher than normal for multiple reasons, because there might be a labor shortage, and because there's a because workers, because there's a labor shortage, then you're not having the output of materials. And because you're not having the output of materials, then you have an issue with supply and demand. And so if you have half a dozen cars, as an example, and you have 20 people that want to buy a car, then you're going to see the prices go up because it's supply and demand. And those are simple examples, but we will go through a thoughtful process to take into consideration what is happening in the world and how would that impact, availability of materials, et cetera. I mean, over the past 2 years, I think we've all heard about unusual things happening, like a ship being stuck in the Suez Canal, and other ships can't get through, so they had to drive halfway around the world just to get their materials. And then we have a bottleneck in California where materials are being offloaded. And then you have Texas that had these storms, and people lost heat and electricity. And then we had tornadoes. So what we can predict, we will work towards identifying, but there are things that just happen, like Ukraine, that sometimes it's beyond all of us. But as long as we are aware of those things that are happening, and that we are looking at not just Scanspit's resources or KPA's resources, but we're looking at associations and studies and information that's being provided from national sources that we can start to look at, well, what are the impacts? And how does that influence design, right? Do we choose certain materials that we know might not be readily available, or do we try to be creative with that? And so there's lots of ways to work towards mitigating those concerns. But I think the closer we get to the time when you would actually be bidding and building, then we would be building in the appropriate contingencies, which all that means is we know it needs to be done. We might not know exactly whether it's a brick or curtain wall, but we're going to carry money for that because we know we're going to do that. And then every time we go through a design update, there'll be 3 different estimate iterations that take place during the feasibility study. But then once the project is approved, assuming you have an approved project, then there's 3 more iterations of design and estimates that take place. And then the final bid, really the market tells you how close we are with that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I just, I've seen in the past, studies are done, estimates are given, and then all of a sudden you come back in 2 years and say prices have changed, or, just wanted to make sure.
I can appreciate that. Yes, yes.
Can you be sure to repeat the questions, because we can't hear from back?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Microphone, please state.
I'm sorry. The question was about estimating and how would we manage cost implications. Thank you. I didn't realize that. Yes?
As far as you can see, is this site, this parcel of land, likely to be the location of whatever we do? Or is there any greater search required right now that we would expect?
There is a greater search required from the Mass School Building Authority. Even if there are other sites available, we have to do our due diligence to say, well, what's the square footage? What's the footprint of the building? What are the appropriate setbacks? Do we have wetlands? Do we have ledge? Is it in compliance with your regional agreement? There's all kinds of things to be looking at. Does it, do you have enough room for circulation? Are we putting it in a place where it's going to cause a traffic bottleneck or not? So there's a criteria that we will look at for each site. Even if it's to say we reviewed it and this isn't the best option, the location that's available. So it'd be premature, and we would just be guessing if we stated that right now. We have to do our due diligence.
Thank you.
Just wondering, can you go back a slide and review again how many times from here on the MSBA is going to have to approve before we move to the next step?
The question was, how many times will we have to go back for submissions to the MSBA and approvals? If somebody could go back to the last slide, I can tell you the answer is 6. Without looking at the slide, but if we could make the slide available. There we go. So right here. So what you see here is the preliminary design program, which is you might have a half a dozen to a dozen options that we're going to look at. There's a submission to the MSBA. We can't proceed without their review and approval. Then the next would be the preferred schematic. And again, we would narrow that down to 3 to 4 options. and do a deeper dive on those options, and again, submit to the Mass School Building Authority. They would do their review, and we cannot proceed until we have their approval. It will happen a third time, that when we submit the schematic design, again, that will happen once, so you'll have 3 times that the MSBA will conduct reviews of the submissions. Once the project is approved, we will go through another 3 iterations of design, meaning 100% design development documents, which is probably about 50% complete with the documents. Then we'll have a review at 60% and another review at 90%. And each of those iterations have to be submitted to the Mass School Building Authority for their review. And we need to respond. We fully expect comments. We need to respond to their comments. A lot of times it's bringing not only the community along, but bringing the Mass School Building Authority along as well to make sure they understand and that the program is being communicated appropriately.
And I think just to add on to what Marianne, can everybody hear me okay? All right. One thing just to add to what Marianne was just mentioning is in each of those submissions, there's a cost estimate done by multiple cost estimators. So not only are they reviewing the quality of the work, they're also reviewing the cost of the work. It's checks and balances through the whole process to make sure that public funds, being your tax dollars, the state's tax dollars, are being spent appropriately in the most fiscally responsible way. So that's where a lot of these reviews come through, is to make sure that we as the design professionals provide quality documents, but also that we're providing a cost-effective project that stays within the budget so that we aren't over budget. It's the multiple checks and balances throughout the process over the many years that we're doing this.
Yes?
What year do you anticipate that construction would begin?
The question is, what year do we anticipate construction would begin? If things go along per this rough schedule, then I anticipate that after an approval, construction, after local approval, and that's kind of a window of time there, because there's an option where you could approve the project contingent on the MSBA approval, or you can wait for the MSBA approval and approve the project within 120 days of that. So you actually really have a 6-month window there from that sense. So then you would have another year of design so that we could get what we call early packages, assuming that we would go have a construction manager on board, and it would allow you to start construction earlier if we had the site work, the foundations, the structure. If we understood that, we could actually start construction while we're completing design. And so depending on whether you had CM at risk and whether, this is 2.5 to 3 years of construction, there's a little float in there, but we had talked about maybe 2027, 2028. But until we actually do the work and complete
It's a delicate balance to that. And Joe, if you wanted to click ahead a couple slides. One more. There, as we're looking, and so when you can see some of these dates up here at the bottom, the construction could potentially begin 2024 as an example, and it's a delicate balance, as Marianne had mentioned, is because time equals money, but at the same time, you don't want to rush something because then it can cost you more money. So it's about making sure you're performing the right amount of analysis, making the right decisions, so that you're not spending money unintentionally, but it's also about doing it in a expedient way to make sure that you're staying on schedule because time does equal money. And there's various avenues to go about that, and even as we go through this process, then we'll, with the MSBA, is finding out what the right solution is as far as even construction delivery for the timing of the project.
So for example, depending on the option selected, let's say it was a renovation project or a renovation addition. You need to create the addition so that you could create the swing space, and you might have 4 phases. And now the school is occupied. So that could be a 4, or I think Arlington High School, is that 5 years? 4 years, 5 years, or 4 years for the renovation. If it was new construction, it could be 2.5, 3 years, 3.5. So it all depends on which option is selected will drive and determine what the schedule is. Yes?
First, thank you for being here. And so you had an image of 2 schools on the first slide. And I'm just curious whether it's those schools or other projects. Do you see some consistent issues or obstacles that have come up in those?
The 2 schools, what was it?
So in those projects, are you consistently seeing issues that come up or obstacles, that might not be unique to a project, but you're consistently seeing them across the projects?
The question was, do we see problems come up consistently across all projects, or are they unique? I'm gonna say both. That every school is unique depending on when it was built and how it was designed. And so, for example, there's one project I know of where steam pipes to heat the building were all put under the slab of the building. And because they were using steam pipes, the floor to ceiling heights were very low. Well, that particular school would have required, in order to replace the heating and ventilation system and put ductwork up in the ceiling, and to put a fire suppression system, sprinklers, in the building, would have required them to take the roof off and raise the roof by approximately 3 feet. Well, that was unique to that school because their steam pipes were under the slab. That would have been very invasive to be taking the roof off of a structure and having an occupied school. So, but to answer your question, there are certain things that we see across all projects that are a common function of time. When you have a building that is 50 years old or 60 years old, the one thing they have in common is that the systems are old and tired. They might not comply with the building code. The structure might not comply with accessibility requirements, that they're not energy efficient. So there's some common themes, and I believe that's why the statement of interest application is designed the way it's designed, because they're trying to pull out those common themes. What are the issues with the building? And so I don't want to go on too long, but did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I was just anticipating with this project, you have the influence of the age of the school or whatever else, just put those nuances. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Hi, I'm curious about in partnering with the MassSBA, the level of funding that we receive from them, what sort of things we should be conscious of moving forward as far as how much money we get from them in funding the project, and kind of what's a normal expected level of participation on that as far as funding.
Okay. So the feasibility study agreement says that currently, I'm sorry.
She was asking what the level of reimbursement might be for a school such as this from the MSBA.
Thank you, sorry. So, I went right for the answer, sorry. So, the feasibility study agreement between the Mass School Building Authority and the district has a reimbursement rate of 49.53% reimbursement. There's a caveat of eligible costs. Okay, so if you look at 963 CMR, they talk about the whole overall grant program. They specify how much square footage you can have, the number of students you have. They specify what they'll pay for and what they won't pay for. So they won't pay for a swimming pool, we know that. They won't pay for a field house. So they won't pay for legal fees. They won't pay for you to buy a different property. So when you look at that grant and the requirements of the grant, they also tell you what they have what they call the space summary document, so that based on the number of students and the programs that you're teaching, that classrooms have to have a certain square footage. So if you exceed that, so I'm going to do simple math here just to illustrate that they will reimburse for 2/3 occupancy of an auditorium as long as it doesn't exceed 750 people. So that's a capacity issue. So what if you have a school that has 1,500 students? That says, well, gee, 2/3 is 1,000. And they say, well, sorry, we capped it at 750. And you might say, but we want to be able to hold a gathering in the school where we can accommodate the entire high school. And they say, well, you're going to have to do it in 2 sessions because they're not going to allow you to do that unless you want to pay for that. So if you add spaces that are categorically ineligible or ineligible because they exceed the guidelines, then they're going to take money off of the grant. And so it's kind of like your taxes. I'm just thinking of that now, but it's kind of like your taxes. It's an effective rate and not like a flat rate. And so when we add all the things that you're eligible for, if you designed a school that was strictly based on, put your educational program aside, on the Mass School Building Authority requirements, you could maximize on that 49.53%. You could get that. But what are the things that you want for your community that you're giving up and not taking advantage of the fact that if you did it on your own at a later date, it would cost more money. So there are trade-offs there for that. But the short answer is 49% of eligible costs. And I have seen projects where after you get to the actual reimbursement, could drop 10%, could drop 20%. It all depends on how much space falls in that ineligible category.
To add on to that, just as she mentions the base and then there's ineligibles, they do offer incentives as well, which can increase your reimbursement rate. And those are all, there's maintenance, meaning they'll evaluate the building and how well you maintained your buildings through the years. So they'll reward you and give you more if you show that you've done a good job taking care of your investments you've made. Sustainability, they'll give additional 2% reimbursement if you meet certain sustainability criteria. So those are things that they'll incentivize for you to spend additional funds to achieve those things. So while it is we, as Marianne mentioned, that the 49.53% is the current baseline. If we can guarantee right now it won't be that exact number in the end as we go through this, but there's ebbs and flows with everything, just like doing your taxes.
Yes.
You just mentioned capacity of the auditorium. I'm wondering what you're thinking about in terms of capacity for the new building or renovated building, and if you don't have a particular number, how you're going to consider that in this process.
I'm going to turn it over to the designer.
Okay. So the question was, has the enrollment been, how is the enrollment determined for the project? That was determined as part of the early phases of the project, working with MassSBA, where they do demographic studies, enrollment projections, and as part of that, then there's an agreed upon based on historical data. So the new project, I say the new project, the project is part of the baseline of the feasibility will be studying an enrollment of 925 students in the building.
To give you a sense, we are 887 students today. I don't think they all came to class today, but if they were, it was 887.
other questions? Yes, sir.
It sounds like this feasibility process has been around for a little while now. What is the percentage that actually will end up in a new build versus renovation versus an addition?
The question is that it seems like the feasibility study process has been around for a while. What are the percentages of new versus renovated? Without looking at the Mass School Building Authority website and doing an analysis, I really can't answer that question. But they do have information available on their projects about whether it was new construction or renovation. Now, it can be counterintuitive, where you can go in and you might think, well, we're not building 100% new, so therefore renovation might be less expensive, which may or may not be the case. If you have a situation like Attleboro and you have to remove the roof and you have an incredible amount of structural replacement and reinforcement that has to be done, then you start to say, that's tipping towards new. And once we vet that, we would be able to say, this option costs X and that other option costs Y. But it's not our choice. It's really thinking about what kind of investment do you want to make, and whether you want to spend X dollars for renovation or X plus Y for new, or maybe it's X minus Y for new, all depending on what the individual challenges are of that specific building.
It is really tough to give an answer, and because every project is very different in that, and so even using categorical data is tough. We recently did a project that we walked in, and it's going to be an ad reno. We can't afford a new building. And then it turned into, wow, it's so expensive to do an ad reno. We need to do a new building, but we can't build it here. And then it turned into, well, the only place to build it is there because that's the most cost-effective place. So it's all through the process of getting to there that the things that your predetermined notions even, and that's why we really don't have any, because oftentimes even those predetermined notions, once you actually get all the facts and the figures, everything considered, it can be very different.
Is technology and equipment for the building included in the project, or just like
The question was, if I can paraphrase, what would be in the project, for instance? So, as part of the project, it would include the building and the scope related to it. So it's broken into a budget of the building construction, what they call furniture, fixtures, and equipment, the FF&E. And so that would be the desks, the chairs, as well as then a technology budget, which is the computers, the technology, and all those. So all those would be accounted for in the project budget. They each have their own bucket as far as the funds, and what that actual value will be determined, we don't know. So schools, when a school does do it, they're not going to buy all the furniture, they're not going to buy all the technology. There'll be stuff brought over. It's all on what you do to make that work within whatever your set budget is determined.
My question is, this timeline seems like a lot slower than I was expecting. I thought it was going to jolt pretty sooner than so it's like some perhaps I was misinformed or had the wrong impression. I mean, is this, I'm sure you guys are professionals and trust that our committee shows the right thing, but I guess I'm wondering what is driving a slower schedule here? I mean, I know there's a lot of unknowns, but we're not as big a town as Arlington, right? There are a lot more opportunities for space at a much larger school. So are you guys just being very conservative because you don't know how big the red box is? Or is it driven more regulatory? So the MassSBA says, look, start now, doesn't matter what size the school is, assuming this is the way it's going to work, unless you guys, do something outside the box. So.
Okay, I'm going to try and do the Reader's Digest version, for those of you who know what it is, of the question, which is, why is this taking so long? I thought it might happen faster. Is that fair? Okay, thank you. So the reason why it takes so long is that there's a very linear, rigorous process that we have to go through. And when you look at the modules, Module 3A, 3B, and Module 4, we need to actually do the work and make it, and identify what, and confirm what are the issues of the building. And in going through this process, it takes a certain amount of time. And then we are also working around the MassSBA schedule. The MassSBA has board meetings roughly every other month. They have a facilities assessment subcommittee. And when we submit something, we might be submitting it 6, 7, sometimes 8 weeks in advance of a board meeting. And so we're not allowed to get ahead of ourselves in the process with the MassSBA. So, there are kind of waves here of activity and what happens with the work. That's my perspective, that when we put this schedule together, if you talk to the design team, they might think it's an aggressive schedule because they're doing a lot of they're doing a lot of vetting here. But there's always an opportunity when we see an opportunity for picking up time in the schedule. I look at it as an opportunity for saving money and escalation. And so, so we're always pushing to find the efficiencies, but we're not going to cut corners. We have to do the work. We have to do the analysis.
My hearing is going, I may have misunderstood. I thought the current enrollment was in the ballpark of 850, sir? Is that all right?
We're 887 students at Nashoba.
87.
Yeah.
And the projected enrollment for a new building was?
925.
I'm concerned because Bolton alone is getting hit with a 229 anticipated 40B unit that we're going under right now. We're in early discussions. There's obviously this push by the state for more and more 40B, to get more affordable housing. That sounds like a difference that could well be exceeded by the time anything gets really built. Are things like 40B projects, immigration and so on being taken into account? I don't know if you're aware of some of these things, but they certainly have to be. We may be building, I'm worried we're building a building that's too small as it opens.
So I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to let you answer. I'm going to give you my opinion. The question was about, with everything that's going on with immigration and new projects for 40B and potential increase in the number of students that will be, I'm paraphrasing, will be coming to the school. Are we building a big enough school? So the design enrollment is 925 students. When the school is designed, that 925 students is a school at 85% capacity. So do the math that the school is big enough that you could actually have 15% more students and not have overcrowding. That's the theory. The Mass School Building Authority has gone through a process already with this community where there have been discussions, and it may have been with the prior administration, where they talked about the 40B projects, they talked about immigration, and what the Mass School Building Authority does is they do an analysis, they go back, I believe it's 10 years, that they go back and they look at the number of births, the number of deaths, they look at how many students you have starting in pre-K, kindergarten, through all of the school years, and they have this analysis, and then they project, how you're trending and what they believe the needs are. One of the concerns is that the mission of the Mass School Building Authority is to support the community and their program for the school, but they don't want to overbuild and have empty spaces. So I'll digress one more minute, and I had a project 10 years ago where we went through this whole process of scheduling the building. And when the building was scheduled, it all of a sudden we said, you're going to have 27 empty classrooms. You're only filling that classroom 3 times a day instead of 5 or 6 times a day. And so we need to look at all of it for the efficiencies, because you don't want to build something more than you need or utilize, because then you have to maintain that oversized space as well, and heated, and et cetera, and pay for it.
I wanted, if we could we'll take one more question right now, because we do have more stuff to cover tonight. We want to be sensitive to everybody's time. We will get more time for questions if people have questions that we could circle back to at the end. Excuse me. We just want to make sure we're sensitive as we cover information that people are here to see tonight. So we'll take one more question.
Yeah, I was wondering if teachers and students are going to be able to be a part of this process, and how are they going to be a part of the process? Because I'm thinking about 27 extra classrooms, so that's not usually the case in schools these days, especially not in this area.
Yeah, I think your superintendent's been very active in that. So
they've already been part of the process. So prior to even bringing on our team, the school district last year went through with a consultant to prepare the original educational plan submission to the MassSBA, which is about what the current programming looks like. We took the work of Dr. Foster, brought it into the feasibility vision sessions that were February 10th, 11th, and 18th. That was a cross-section of 50 people, residents of the community, town leaders, district leaders, teachers. We had 14 fabulous students across a cross-section of experiences and interests in school, and we brought in students whose school has worked well for them. We brought in students who told us school hasn't worked well for me, because we want to gain that wide experience along the way. And our teachers have been working with the consultants on the educational design program. They'll continue to be a part of the process. Having been through this process in another district, they'll be in this process right up through construction, and frankly, even post-move-in. I know in the previous project I was involved in, we had to make adjustments with the digital touch boards and various things, bringing in some storage units based upon they came in the building and experienced something. There were contingencies remaining in the budget to pay for those costs, so we were able to cover that. So they will be involved in the process all the way through.
yeah, and just to do a little bit market tease on that, we're actually going to be talking at that next public forum. So what we'll do now is we'll actually turn it over to Joe Milani from CastleVos to talk about the existing conditions review that our team has done so far on the building.
Thank you. Close enough? Yes. This is an exciting part of the presentation that I'm sure we're all thrilled to see these conditions. Tonight we're reporting on the existing conditions. We're not making any judgments, recommendations, cost estimates, reviews. It's just to tell you what's going on in the building, very high level. To do this, we looked at the building both on site visually, and we looked at existing drawings that were provided by the district for the previous renovation addition project in 2000. We did not do any destructive investigations and demolition in the building to look at subsurface or concealed conditions. We only looked at stuff we could see. The process reviews the building in relation to current code requirements, and that's only to give a basis of what would have to be done to bring the building up to be compatible with current code. The building certainly was built to code at the time each of the additions and renovations were done, but codes change over time, and as part of this review that is taken into consideration. As I said, we aren't doing a detailed, very specific presentation tonight. We're giving examples of conditions that we've seen in the building. We've had a number of different consultants come through the building and look at it. But this estimate, this is very important because this is going to provide us with a basis for an estimate that gets used through the process of the PDP. And one of the reasons the PDP takes so long, we have to provide 4 options to the MassSBA. The first option is called the repair option. That's just looking at the building and replacing and fixing anything that's wrong with the building that's a code requirement or that is a a system that is out of use. It doesn't address any of the educational program requirements of the building. It is only repairing the building. That forms a basis for looking at all the other options that we're going to look at. So the second option you look at is a renovation option. If the building is able to accommodate the program that's developed with the administration with KBA to look at the amount of spaces that are necessary in the school, and the educational program can be accommodated as well as the repair process. That's the renovation option. There's a renovation addition option, which is the same thing except with new spaces that are added to the building, either replacing existing spaces that have to be removed and replaced, or by adding on to the building to accommodate a larger population. And then there's a new option. The new option looks at, taking down the existing building, either building a new building on the same site or somewhere else. And just to make a point, the question that was brought up about whether or not we have mostly new buildings or renovated buildings. I have two projects that I worked on recently. One where we went in and they thought they needed just a renovation addition to the building, and that turned out to be a completely new building, shoehorned onto the site. Another one where they thought they really wanted a new building, and that project wound up being a renovation addition to the building. So really, you have to let the process go forward and inform you about what you're going to do. You can't really make any assumptions now because it just doesn't, because the process doesn't work that way. We have had several consultants, as I said, several consultants come through the building, site work for landscaping and civil work, building envelope, both myself and structural engineer, material environment, structural systems, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. Architect is not up there, but it was reviewed also. Security systems, food service, all of it reviewed. We are in the process this week of reviewing the hazardous materials within the building. That sampling and testing is ongoing right now, and that report will be coming. Geotechnical analysis of the soils outside the building will be happening in the near future once we have a little more idea of where the building might go and what site we might use. Geoenvironmental is looking at hazardous materials that may be subsurface on the site. That's looking at old underground storage tanks for gasoline or oil or whatever. That engineer has completed his study. He only needs information from the geotechnical report to complete it. And then traffic will happen based on when we have a better idea what site we're going to use. And that will allow us to have an idea if there's any traffic implications from the school being, bus traffic from the school. As I said, all of this will be provided in a very detailed report that will be a few hundred pages long in the final PDP package that's going to the MassSBA in June. So on the site, it's about 50 acres. We have been looking at other sites in other towns, and in this town that are 50 acres in size, just to do our due diligence, as Mary Ann mentioned. But on this site, it's reviewed for the existing conditions analysis. It's about, like I said, 50 acres. The biggest constraint on the site is the pipeline that runs and bisects the site from west to east. It limits what we can do in the back of the site, limits what we can do moving forward. The site is extremely well packaged, you can see, either with buildings or fields. One of the other constraints we have is the grade change from the east side of the site to the west side of the site is a grade change of about 30 feet. And then there are ups and downs within that site that obviously limit accessibility of the site and make construction a little more difficult with grade changes. There are wetlands both in the south and to the north, which the setbacks and buffers for those provide restrictions on what we can build. There's an on-site sewage treatment plant because there's no town septic at this point, and then that is gone to a leaching field up back. There's on-site water from the well. Those all provide constraints that we have to work around when we're looking at a location for a possible new building or an addition on the site. There is a small amount of floodplain activity that's active in the back that's on the GIS mapping. The underground structures in the site that were replaced in the 2000 renovation were quite extensive. However, it's noted by our civil engineer that there are several pipes that are still old clay pipes that will have to be replaced at any renovation that's done on the site. And then, as I said, accessibility is difficult on such a hilly site that changes grade. But our engineers and our landscape architects will work with that as we develop plans for that use. Again, for accessibility around the existing site, the grandstands are accessible. There's ramps going to the grandstands. There are site locations for handicap seating. However, the press box is not. There is a lift there that doesn't work right now, and the lift really needs to be by code an elevator that's enclosed. Obviously, an enclosed elevator would form a door rather than an open lift. But that will have to be replaced in any renovation. Paving around the site is a little worn, and especially at handicap spots, getting from the handicap space onto the building or the entrance is a little difficult. They'll also have to be repaired. And then within the courtyard space in the building, really nice accessible spaces for teaching outside. Unfortunately, the sidewalks and some of the stairways don't meet code and make getting around in a wheelchair really difficult. So this school, this school was originally built in the early 60s. Was added onto in the around 1970, early 70s with the gym and the library additions. And then in 2000, there was a large renovation project where most of the systems of the building were replaced. And the gymnasium was expanded, some administration space was added, and the auditorium significantly was added. The building right now is about, according to the assessor's office, 201,000 square feet. We'll take that into consideration as we go through our analysis and our schematic designs. So the existing building, this floor plate, which is the upper level floor plate, is the largest. This is about 133,000 square feet. By code, you're allowed for this use and this type of construction to build 76,000 square feet before you have to have another building. And so what they did, I'm sorry. What they did in 2000 edition was they built the auditorium at this end and they built a firewall. And a firewall is sort of like an expansion joint. It's a separation of two separate buildings, this building and this building. The buildings only have to be an inch or two apart. It's not like you're building a building across campus. People look at the building, they don't know it's two separate buildings, but the fire rating between them allows one building to burn down while the other one stays standing. It's a safety measure that basically allows you to increase the square footage of the building while still maintaining safety. In that same renovation in 2000, they classified walls here and here as also being firewalls because the residual area here is about 110,000 square feet, which is more than the 76,000 square feet you're allowed per floor. So they said that this and this were a firewall, but they actually are not constructed as firewalls under today's code. Like I said, back in the day, they probably had some conditions where those would be allowed in that configuration, but right now they're not. So in any renovation we have to do, these would have to be rebuilt, structure would have to be added so that these become true firewalls. There are 11 stairs in the building, so we have more than enough egress getting out of the building in terms of passage from upper floors to lower floors. Some of the stairways exit into corridors directly, for instance here and here, and so those corridors have to be reconfigured so that they provide fire-rated construction around them so that stairway goes directly outside. So the exterior skin of the building, or the building envelope. The two things that really are enemies of the building envelope are thermal expansion and water. Water getting into the building through joints or cracks in the building, whatever, but that also is exacerbated by thermal movement in the building. We see in the building deterioration of the exterior shell with water infiltration, cracking in the walls, spalling of brick. One thing to consider is that in 1960 and 70 constructions, there is no vapor barrier between the inside and outside of the building, and there is no insulation between the outside and the inside of the building. Two things that are required by today's code. The windows and doors are, by and large, not compliant with today's code. Even where they are aluminum, they're not thermally broken. Even where they're insulating glass, it doesn't meet today's U-value requirements, but the bulk of the windows are either steel frame and single glaze, which doesn't comply either. And the roof is outlived its useful life. It's leaking and would have to be replaced in any regard, whether or not we go through with a new building or repair this building. So, here you can see the roof has got like 3 or 4 different types of roofing on it. There's some original roofing that is tar and gravel type of ballasted stone, you want to call it ballasted stone roof. A lot of the roof is white, you can see. It's a white membrane roof, a PVC membrane roof. Some areas of the roof are shingles, like this area and this area. Each one of them was repaired or replaced in 2000. Typically, the lifespan for roofs at that time was only 20 years, and they've already outlived their useful life of doing the best they can. You wind up with problems that are caused by ponding. When water finds a place that's a low point in the roof, it settles in, it depresses the insulation, the hole gets bigger. The next rainstorm or ice storm that comes in, it compresses it more, it gets bigger. The more weight from the more water, it gets bigger. What that leads to is not just that water sits on the roof for longer periods of time, but the water has a chance to sit on the roof for longer periods of time. It finds a way in. And when it finds a way in, you wind up with problems. Most of the roof in the 1960s version of the building is what's called a poured gypsum deck. And what that was between the structural members of the roof, there is a form board underneath, either insulation or gypsum board, that's filled on top with a poured gypsum product. So it's like pouring concrete on top of the roof. It becomes self-leveling. They like it then because it gives you a nice level roof. The problem with it is anyone that's ever worked with gypsum board in your house, when gypsum board gets wet, it falls apart. And the key is to keep the gypsum deck dry. Here you see the problem that's happened. In a lot of cases where the water is penetrated through bonded areas where the leaks are occurring in the main roof, you get the gypsum board delaminating and falling apart. This actually is a photograph by our structural engineer who took it under this shingle roof. The shingle roof was added in the 2000 renovation, we assume, because the condition of the gypsum deck was so poor that rather than replace the gypsum deck, they felt that this was a more economical way to preserve the roof. This occurs in other locations also throughout the building, and so in any case, we recommend that as an expensive repair to make. As I said, the two main enemies of the exterior shell are water and thermal expansion. Here is a really good example. In a brick building, brick veneer building, the brick veneer is intended to be a weather barrier. It keeps the water out from inside the building. Behind this brick is a cavity, a gap between the brick and the backup wall, whether that backup wall is studs with sheathing, whether that backup wall is concrete block or whatever. But that gap forms an important purpose because as you get a strong rainstorm, this brick becomes saturated. Brick is very porous, so it absorbs water. And as the water gets more and more saturated in the brick, it eventually comes up the backside of the brick and it drips down into the cavity and it goes to the bottom of the cavity where it sits. At the bottom of the cavity are these holes in the brick joints called weeps, and that's exactly what I just said. It lets the water weep out of the cavity of the building. However, when the weeps get clogged or the construction doesn't suit it, what happens is that the water sits and, God forbid, it freezes, because when water freezes, everyone knows it expands. And when water expands, it has to go somewhere. So here you can see there's a crack that starts about right here, and it gets bigger as it goes down the wall. And it's actually separated the outside brick here from the back. And you can see along here, the brick has been pushed out about an inch beyond the face of the concrete. And at this point, actually, the bond between the brick and the brick mortar and the concrete lintel was so strong that it actually spalled a piece of the concrete off as the brick was pushed out of the way. This occurs on the west side of the building, all along the west side of the building. Here you can also see a piece of the concrete lintel that is actually spalled off by itself. On the north side of the building, you have a similar condition where brick has been decayed or deteriorated from water infiltration and degradation. This happens in these streets along the north side of the building, where degradation has happened in the jointing of the bricks. A condition where you've got, again, water coming down at the bottom of the wall, not being able to get up. This is at the gym, and there's a platform here where the ramp comes up to go to the gym, and unfortunately the weeps are down here, and the gym platform's up here, and so when the water comes down the wall, it's got nowhere to go. And so eventually what's happened is that, I'm surmising that through freeze-thaw, that the water's been captured there, and it's frozen and spalled out the brick. Similar's happening on the bottom of the wall. There's a lot of places where the bottom of the brick wall, the foundation line, has been spalling. If you walk around the building, you see this jagged edge as you walk around the building. Here they try to repair it by filling in with brick and some water. It's not very pretty, but hopefully it's doing the trick. But that occurs in a lot of places, and I'm surmising again that that's from a degradation due to freeze thaw around the building. Exterior walls are also cast in place concrete. We have a lot of places in the 1970s building where cast-in-place concrete was used. It's exposed both on the outside and the inside. A lot of places in the buildings back then where elements were exposed outside and inside while being separated as they are today with installation of vapor batteries. And that leads to degradation because you've got vapor movement going through and getting captured within the elements. There's a crack that's formed, and shouldn't be alarmed about structural engineers. Look at all these things, and our structural engineers determine that these aren't a risk right now at all. So these are conditions that should be repaired, but aren't really a safety risk as we look at them. Here again is more concrete on top of a more concrete beam where the water's got the load and spalled it off. And one thing that you'll notice as you look around this building is a lot of places where the existing structure is exposed. And that was very common back in the 60s and 70s. Here you have a steel beam for the floor slab that's exposed, and that's the steel beam for the floor slab of the building. It's exposed on the outside where it's cold, it's exposed on the inside where it's warm, and it will condense and decay. Here you can see the concrete floor of the building that actually extends from inside the building out over the beam and is exposed outside of the building. Now this was originally covered by some aluminum facing material, but over time that has leaked, and as the water has gotten in to the concrete and has rusted the rebar in the concrete, you can see it also. The rebar expands when it rusts, just like water expands when it freezes. And when that rebar expands, it falls off the concrete, creating a condition that's simply going to continue to degrade over time. Whenever you have exposed structure inside and outside of a building, you're going to wind up with this kind of an issue. And then there's also precast concrete, not just cast-in-place concrete. You see this element around the building all the time. This is mostly 1970s renovation addition, as I recall. This is a structural precast concrete window unit. Created the site in pieces. The unit goes over there, and there. They're brought to the site, tilted up, anchored in place. This is tied into both the steel beams on top of the wall, and here you can see go from the inside of the building and sit on the window jamb, and here sit on the window jamb, and here sit on the window jamb. They're welded, our structural engineer said, to the top of the precast concrete wall, which is very unusual. What that does is it restricts movement, and when you get a steel beam that, in most cases, as you can see over here, is exposed on the outside and creating a thermal bridge with what's on the inside, the differential movement from thermal action of that beam is causing stress in that concrete because it's welded and it can't relieve the stress. That's led to some cracking, although, oops, geez, sorry. I needed a primer on the screen. It has led to some stresses and some cracking, as we'll see later, but it's not a structural issue that requires replacement right now. Here you can see a section that was in the 2000 construction drawings. And you can see in here that these precast units go from inside to outside directly. This is the inside face, and that's the outside face. Through that concrete is an opportunity for thermal bridging, we call it, where the heat moves from hot to cold, either inside to outside or outside to inside. That also leads to a place where vapor drive can go around the building. They did make attempts at putting in insulation where they could, like here, and putting vapor barriers there and there. You know, like throwing a boulder into a river, the water simply flows around it. And so when you've got opportunities for vapor to travel through a building, it does. And in essence, it can wreak havoc over a long period of time.
One thing I just want to add to everything that Joe's saying is play a little bit of good cop, bad cop for a second.
Which one?
Well, yeah. Where as Joe's talking about all these these challenges that exist in the current building. And the reason I bring it up now is when you're looking at even the drawings from 2000, is the district has done a great job maintaining the building. I think that shouldn't be discounted when we're talking about this. A lot of things we're talking about here are systemic issues, and they're at the root of the building and not anything that the building hasn't been well maintained. I think that just needs to be said, as we've done in all our reviews, that they've done a great job maintaining a building that has its own challenges systemically.
And then also precast concrete issues on the outside of the building. Precast rebar wasn't treated. Oops, do it again. Precast rebar wasn't treated with epoxy coating, and you can see it's exposed. Again, water infiltrates the concrete, causes rust, and it falls off the concrete. This will continue to decay unless it's treated. Again, here's one of the precast window panels where hairline cracks have developed. These have also developed at the base and continue down into the foundation wall. Our structural engineer is reviewing those. And then at precast veneer elements, where we see a lot of degradation from water. The water runs down the face of the brick, hits the top of this water table, it sticks out on the precast, and just causes some degradation and spalling. With joint sealants, this is a tricky issue to deal with. There are joint seals all over the building. As I said, when you have different materials on the outside of the building that are expanding and contracting through thermal movement at different rates, you wind up pushing and pulling the sealants, and eventually they fail. It's an ongoing maintenance condition that has to be dealt with all the time. And this may just be the issues that we saw that are new this year, but they will recur somewhere else next year. So not to say that this won't happen in a new building, but it does lead to problems in this building. Here you can see between this door frame and this metal wall panel, you basically see inside the building that this was a joint seal that was forgotten. And then there are joint seals at the bottoms that are also leaking some water. So exterior doors and windows. There are really three types of exterior doors and windows in the building. The first one is steel. And this is either steel windows formed out of steel shapes like this with single glazing in them, or it's hollow metal frames with insulating glass in them. All of the exterior doors are hollow metal. And the problem, obviously, with having steel on the outside of the building is that steel rust. No matter what you do, how many times you paint it, steel rust. Again, we have the precast window units that have aluminum windows in them. There are some areas, like in the wood shop, where these units still have the single glazed windows in them. But by and large, they are insulating glass units. Even though that glass might not meet current standards, it's better than having single glazed glass. And then also, there are conditions where we have this plastic sandwich panel. This is a layer of polycarbonate on the outside and on the inside, separated by a metal spacer that is filled with insulation. The opacity of the unit is dependent on how much insulation is in. Sorry? Yeah, please. The opacity is dependent on how much insulation is in the space. This is in the art room, this is in the courtroom. So with the steel, as I mentioned, you have a condition where all the steel doors and frames are steel and they rust. Here you can see a condition where the steel on the bottom of the door is completely rusted away. What you're seeing, that white part there, is the grout that's actually inside the door frame. Here you've got a metal window where it's kind of hard to see the shading here, but there's a hole right there where the steel is completely rusted through. Again, you can see rust developing on some of the steel windows here. And this is something that is almost impossible to maintain because the steel is continuous from the inside to the outside. So when the outside temperature is cooler than the inside temperature, you're going to wind up with condensation on the outside of the steel, which is then going to lead to rust. And if you have vice versa, you're going to wind up with condensation on the inside of the steel, which is going to lead to rust. Rust and water don't really mix, and so that's why we don't really use steel windows anymore, because they're not thermally acceptable. And then here's a condition at the top of these typical window units where the structural steel extends out through and supports an overhang on the roof. This steel continues all the way into the building, obviously forming a thermal bridge. So the steel, when it's cold outside, means the steel on the inside is cold, and when it's cold outside, this is cold. So this leads to degradation of the paint finish on the steel. It transfers heat from the building, and this, as I said, was typical of work that was done in the 60s and 70s, expressing the structure outside of the building. It just becomes very difficult to maintain. Under structural, we have some issues that our engineers are reviewing. There are places where the steel is welded together rather than being attached with bolts and plates. There are cross bracing that was installed in the 2000 renovation that we're investigating to be sure that it's current code. Here you can see again the stress caused in the precast window units from the beam above. Some cracking that's engaged here because of the movement of the steel when the concrete doesn't want to go anywhere. And then basically on top of the roof where they put the shingle roof on, there are attachment issues between the steel trusses and the framing below that we're looking into also. None of which, as I said, are at this point of any danger or any risk to the building. And the interior is very well maintained. The floors are polished. When I went through the building, I didn't see any floor tiles that were missing. However, there is no vapor variable in concrete slabs, which means that you have vapor transmission coming up with the slab just and cause lamination and degradation of the floor systems. We can't tell from the 2000 drawings if they put on a topical vapor barrier on those slabs when went down to the flooring, but that would be part of any renovation project. The walls are painted, the walls are very clean, the walls are very in very good condition. Ceilings are showing their age. There's acoustical ceiling tiles are sagging, which we'll see in a photograph coming up, and the adhered ceiling tiles are falling off the roof, off the ceiling. The hazmat survey is underway right now. I have more idea of what's going on inside the building in terms of hazmat, but there is an error report, which is a report that documents all hazardous materials in a school that every school has to maintain, not just the school, but every school has to maintain on a 3-year basis. And our engineer has that, and he's going through the building of that. We'll know more about that coming up. And accessibility, there are various locations that don't comply with current code. But I will say that when the building was built and renovated in 2000, it did comply with the code then. An example of that would be ramps, like this aisle ramp here. This ramp is 10% in slope. That was okay up to the 2006 redo of the code. Now it's 8%. Not that much is to the handicapped, but that's one of the things that we have to analyze as part of our review. Typical classrooms, you can see in the 1960s classroom, again, the structure is exposed and expressed, open steel beams. On the 1970s classroom, we have everything concealed above the finished ceiling. You can see the finishes, the floors, the walls, all look very well maintained. The issue with the 60s classroom, obviously, is that when you get exposed structure, you get exposed, deck, it winds up being very noisy. Noisy environments make a difficult learning environment. We like to control noise and distribute the sound from the teacher, but not create cacophony inside the room. What this also means is that when you put things up like projectors, conduit, sprinkler systems, it's all exposed in the space. It really becomes more unsightly. The difficulty here is that because the beams of the structure are put onto the top of the window units, it's a very low roof. And as Marianne mentioned before, this isn't the building she was talking about. It was a different building. But that building is the same way. It was reducing the height of the building because the higher building you build, the more it costs. And so this was a way of both expressing the structure, but also reducing the cost of the building. One of the problems with this is, like I said, the acoustics. In some cases, like here, they put acoustical ceiling tiles in between the beams. In some places, they've fastened on some acoustical panels to try and mitigate the sound and reverberation. In the 1970s classrooms, they have a hung acoustical ceiling, which really mitigates the sound well. They have enclosed ductwork within drywall enclosures and soffits. So there is no exposed elements here except for the indirect lighting, which is supposed to be hung in exposed lighting. For ceilings, as I mentioned, you can see where the original glued-on tiles have fallen off. There are some rooms where most of the tiles have fallen off. In some cases where they wanted to mitigate that, they've installed acoustical panels on the ceilings here that are screwed in, or they put up the ceiling tiles as I showed you in the last photo. Outside the classrooms and the corridors, the ceiling tiles are showing their age, especially 2x4 tiles are really difficult because they absorb moisture, and as they absorb moisture, probably can't see too far away, but you can see you get a pillowing effect. As the center of the tile wants to sag down under its own weight, the corners pull up and becomes kind of like a little pillow. Showing me that the tiles are going to be replaced. Good thing is that the wood's in really good shape. You can replace the tiles for minimal cost. And then you've got stain ceiling tiles, which are indicative of this. I should have zooomed in more. There's a big stain in this corner of the music room, indicative of water leaks coming from the roof. Flooring, as I said, is still in really good condition. A lot of the floors in the 60s building are terrazzo, which is extremely durable. It does have some surface cracking that has been maintained. Where walls have been removed, those have been patched with grout. But by and large, this is polished and in really good shape. Here you've got a transition between 1960s terrazzo flooring and the 1970s VCT or biocomposite tile flooring. The joint here is very well done. It's actually under this dot. There's a big spall part right there. Thank you, Fred. But by and large, the flooring in itself, except for the transition, is in really good shape. Here's one condition outside the cafeteria heading towards the wood shop where there's an expansion joint here that continues through the wall and into the kitchen. And I'm going to guess that there's some vertical transmission of movement here that's causing these two slabs to move differentially and to cause this concrete and the VCT to spall. Typically, you don't need the expansion joints and concrete slabs on grade because the floor is sitting on the grade already. It doesn't go anywhere. But in this case, you're getting a lot of breakage of the tile. There must be a reason for it. And then there's one condition in the bathrooms. The bathrooms, by and large, are tile. A lot of them are new tile. The tile's in very good condition. This occurs in the 1970s edition, classroom edition on the far end of the school, the west end, on the first floor. And where there must have been a problem with the tile, I didn't take up any of the sheet vinyl that's on top of it. But even the sheet vinyl is now degrading and falling apart on top of the tile. I'm going to guess there must be a moisture mitigation problem at this end of the school that's causing it to happen. But that is an isolated condition in that one place. For universal accessibility, again, these are examples. And as I said, back when the building was built, these met the code requirements. Now we're looking at them under current code requirements, and they don't really comply. So signage, in a lot of places, signage is dislocated. It's either on doors or the wrong place related to a door. It doesn't have a journal on it. And those will be replaced in any renovation that's done in the building. Tiers for choral or orchestral presentations. Believe it or not, these have to have ramps to get to all tiers. You can't segregate people because they can't access a tier, whether they're using a wheelchair or a cane or whatever. They have to be able to get to sing or play instruments with the same group of people that they're with. And so in recent schools, when we've done these things, they do make risers with ramps. They take up a lot more space. And so we have to reconfigure that room to accommodate those risers. We do have casework in the building. Casework, by and large, is in good shape. There isn't a lot of it except for the sign slabs. The sign slabs are a little bit worn, but they're still in really usable condition. But they don't have, and a lot of the older casework drops for accessible workstations. A typical workstation for a countertop is 34 inches, and a typical workstation for a handicapped accessible space is 30 inches. So it just doesn't have the right height in these things that can be renovated to provide that. Again, the lift outside by the press box should be an elevator. It doesn't function right now. It would have to be replaced. And I just mentioned about ramps. Ramps over the building are typically about 10% at a high point, but those need to be done by 8%. Toilets throughout the building, depending when they were built. Some don't meet the requirements for clearances, grab bars and stuff. A lot of the new ones that have been renovated do. This is a condition in one of the teacher bathrooms in the far end of the building. Again, when it was built, this clearance probably was appropriate for the time. The clearance for the center line of the bubbler to the obstruction isn't enough to meet current code. Locker rooms, general lockers throughout the building are in pretty good condition, but they don't provide an accessible locker that doesn't require twisting and turning of the wrist under ADA guidelines. Again, showers in the locker rooms. This is in the girls' locker room. I think we're in the girls' locker room. This has been modified kind of to get it to be somewhat accessible, but it still doesn't meet the requirements of what an accessible shower should be under the code. And then again, another toilet room, which was built long ago, that doesn't have any of the required clearances in a building. It was one of those little toilets you tuck into a corner in the kitchen back in the day, but now it doesn't meet any of the requirements for accessibility. And finding one slide potential. Any questions? Wake up, wake up. Thank you, appreciate it. Oh.
I think this maybe falls under your purview. You haven't really talked about the impacted classes that might be going through potential construction. So with the option of doing renovations, and with a 3-year construction window, you may get 6 class years. Can you just give maybe just some thoughts and examples of how you've seen other school districts accommodate students for overflow classrooms and things like that?
It's a tricky thing because any renovation project is disruptive, and disruption affects education. I'm just finishing a project now in elementary school that's a reno ad. We were able to build a gymnasium, new gymnasium, and we fitted that out with temporary classrooms inside, and that became the swing space. And as long as you have enough swing space to move the classrooms around you during off-schedule times like Christmas breaks and stuff like that, you can make it work. You still have construction and you still have disruption, but by and large, you shouldn't be doing construction during the day in areas where kids are occupied. It does take longer to do a renovation that way because you're shuffling the tiles around to get this area free, and you shuffle those kids over, they get that area free. But by and large, it can be done. It just depends on what area is necessary and what you can move to. We happen to have that available space to use. I would add that MassSBA does not pay for temporary classrooms. If you've got trailers that are being bought to supplement the work inside of a building, the MassSBA will not contribute to temporary classrooms.
Is a part of the planning for, like, do you make recommendations on our existing space here that we could accommodate relocation internally as opposed to having to bring in? The thought of trailers is, I think that's like every parent's worst fear is having your kid like sit in a trailer while they're learning. But again, there's going to be 6 class years potentially. We're talking about a 3-year construction period that are going to be impacted. So I think at some point we'll probably have to have some understanding of what that's going to look like.
Yeah. So the question was, if there is temporary classrooms, or how would that be approached? Would that be a paraphrase of it? So as Joe mentioned, we do multiple different levels of analysis. So if it's a renovation, addition renovation, and as part of those analysis, we would be an addition renovation option or multiple options. We would be looking at different ways of how we do it. So swing space, because there's not always one way to do it. And so we're looking at different ways to find which is the most cost effective, even in that one solution. So as part of those options, we would be analyzing part of that because that factors into how much time it would take to do it, which affects the cost. And so all those, as well as that turns into, and often the committee, when they develop their criteria for what they select their preferred option to be, is that kind of consideration of what impact it does have on the educational, both short-term and long-term, when it comes to those. And again, time is money, and so yes, we would analyze that and come up with different solutions. Sometimes you can come up with solutions, sometimes you can't, and that is all part of things that would be included as pros and cons of each option.
Thank you.
Just a few quick numbers, if I could. I heard a reference to $920
25 students or something like that. That's current enrollment, that's not pro forma 7 or 8 years out.
You know, current enrollment is 887 students. 925 is the MSBA projection based upon 85% occupancy.
And that's done by utilizing demographics, both age, fertility rates, there's all kinds of variables into that, as well as enrollment is a cyclical thing, thanks to the baby boomers. There's ebbs and flows on a 30-year cycle of enrollment too. So all those come into consideration when that enrollment number is a very calculated number as they look at finding what the right size of the building based on all of the variables.
So to that point, square footage per student, is there a metric we should be thinking of, that you think of?
Yes. The MSBA has a space summary guideline that was alluded to, that they typically will put, depending on the enrollment, obviously the more students, the lower cost, the lower square footage per pupil. I believe at 925, it's right around 200 square feet per pupil, roughly. But that is a baseline or a guideline, we call it, because every district is different. And what their needs are for the size of a classroom. Some classrooms might require to be larger than others. What types of classrooms they have. And so that's where you have your guidelines versus what the actual need is. And that's what we'll go through with the why the educational visioning is so important, is to understand what type of spaces needs they are, what size they will, so that we will target that guideline as our basis. And that's also what the grant will be based on.
I know you're not building it today, it's kind of a projection for building costs in 27, 28, but if you were doing it today, hard costs, price per square foot, $400, $500, $600?
We can't really talk about what the price it would cost to build it today, because we'd have to determine whether it's a renovation or new construction, or, is it over 3 years? Is it over 4.5 years? There's a lot of variables there that would impact it. If it was a renovation, then you'd have to take into account your swing space, temporary classrooms. So it's more than just the building, and certainly you could go on the Mass School Building Authority website, but they're showing you what the square foot costs were for buildings that were completed in the past. But the construction, whenever those buildings were completed, the construction could have started, 2, 3, 4 years earlier, depending on the type of project. So it's very risky for us to toss something like that out.
I'll phrase it differently. The most recent projects with which you have experience, price per pound, just for hard costs alone, am I close, $400 to $600 a foot?
It all depends on what the programming is. Vocational spaces are more expensive. Let me just say this, we're completing Attleboro High School, and that's $468 a square foot. But that was based on bidding pre-COVID.
Understood. Thanks.
So,
I think to give you, as Marianne alluded to, the MSBA has all this data. What we're averaging, seeing now, is, to give a range, is exactly what you're saying, around $500 to even $700 a square foot, just because of cost of construction.
Sure. Thank you.
Maybe a naive question. Is there space on this site to build new?
Anything is possible. Sorry, the question was, can we fit a building on this site? And anything is possible. Yes, we've done early just to see. It is possible, but what it looks like, we don't know. And that's part of even our early investigations of understanding what the site is and what's potentially there. So yes, anything's possible. But what that actually means, we don't know yet.
If I can add, in the building project I was involved in, we had a design module, and because of, and not trying to make light of it, there was a rare lizard in the wetlands, changed the footprint of where the place where we could put the footprint, they had to go back and redesign. We went up 4 floors in that particular scenario. So it was amazing to see how clever the architects were in trying to find solutions.
Thank you.
So, Minuteman, I understand you worked at Minuteman or you worked on the Minuteman project. I understand, I think it opened 2 years ago. I understand it's already well into its extra 15% of enrollment. I know it's probably much harder to predict enrollment in such a regional facility, but I'm worried about it around 25.
Okay, first of all, the question was about Minuteman and their enrollment and that they have exceeded their additional 15% to be at 100% capacity and they're turning students away. So I will tell you what I know about that. C and I both with Dale worked on Minuteman. We actually had 3 enrollment numbers. Okay, it was 400, it started with 2, 400 and 800. And the feedback from a couple of the communities, at least surrounding communities, but a couple of the communities was, we don't think there's the financial appetite to build a school for 800 students. Even though at the time, they had more than 800 students in their program. And so, just couldn't move them. A couple of communities, just couldn't move them. So, we studied a 3rd enrollment number, which was 628 students. Okay, that ended up being the preferred solution. I think if the superintendent had his way at the time, they would have gone for the 800. But it's a bigger conversation and involves more people. And to your point, yes, they have a state-of-the-art facility. It's very attractive, and they are attracting a lot of students. But it wasn't an issue with the Mass School Building Authority, because the Mass School Building Authority said, you know, all right, here's 2 enrollment numbers, what do you think? They asked if they could study a 3rd, and the Mass School Building Authority said yes, but it was a result of the input from the member communities that they decided on a number in the middle.
Now, the big issue is that there are 16 communities in the district. And in order to authorize the bond, you have to have a unanimous vote, all 16 communities. And there were, as Marion said, a few communities that didn't vote for it. I think it went to 3 votes.
2 votes.
2 votes on the popular vote.
Yeah.
Then there was a popular vote that was passed. But in order to get to a point where they could actually build a building, the compromise was to do this enrollment. But as Marion said, it wasn't something that was dictated by the MassSBA. It was something that was looked at in terms of feasibility of getting the building. We waited a 1.5 years between Module 4 and Module 6, which is construction documents. What does that call it?
Just to clarify really quickly, the original request was for 1,200 students, and the MassSBA said categorically no, that that's wildly over what you guys are projected to be. And the former superintendent actually fought to get the number much higher, and 925 is the best that she could do at that time, and it's actually higher than the MassSBA wanted. So I think everybody shares your concern, but we're boxed in by that methodology.
The other thing I want to add is that the towns were involved in that discussion, and were given an opportunity to explain what projects were underway, like the apartment complex that has been referred to in Bolton, and I know each of, Lancaster and Stowe also have developments in the works, and so the MassSBA's stance, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that they couldn't take those into account unless they are permanent or permits are approved, indicating that those projects are actually going to move forward. So those things were all part of the discussion that that happened or that never was being tossed around?
There is a YouTube video, and you were absolutely right. That is the conversation that took place. It's available if anybody wants to look it up, and it has to do with just MSBA, Nashoba Regional Design Enrollment, and it's a whole conversation. Yes?
So is it possible to adjust the plans for more students? I mean, you talked about the overages.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes. I like to be the yes man, the good cop. When we design the buildings, we also have to design for future growth. Because you don't want to design a building that boxes you in. So we do plan for future additions and expansion. When we do that, it's not part of the project, but we have to be able to demonstrate that the building has the ability to do that, to grow for those instances. Because just as what was mentioned is the MSBA, they deal with projects all over the state. They have a very strict set of rules, which are very fair rules when you think about the way that they work. So if it's not permitted, there's no guarantee it's going to be happening. And they want to be fiscally responsible across the state. They have to take that approach. But at the same time, we do have to be able to accommodate that. And even their thought process has been said is, if those do get approved, that's additional tax dollars to potentially, if you need to additional accommodations down the road.
And certainly timing, if you told me in a month from now or 5 or 6 months from now that the projects have been permitted and they're actually proceeding, we would have that conversation with the Mass School Building Authority, and they would likely say, okay, let's see if they actually start construction, even though sometimes projects get permitted, but they don't get built.
So Marion, if I can just sort of coalesce those ideas in a question to you.
Yes.
The 925 student enrollment number is the number that is used by the MSBA to ultimately get to the square footage calculation of which they will fund the project at the agreed upon rate. It's still up to the community to decide how they want to construct their building. And so if we said we wanted to construct the building for 1,000 students, we would be 100% on the hook for that delta of 75 students off of the MSBA number.
Correct, and also the cost of permitting, the cost of commissioning, the cost for the designer, the cost for the OPM, that they will find a way to carve out, not to pay for any part of that addition, that 75 student delta.
So the answer is not no. It definitely is something that is always considered, even as we go through this and explore this, as we look both future expansions, how can we be flexible with the design to allow for enrollment spikes? Because as I mentioned, it is a 30-year cycle typically, just because of baby boomers. That enrollments do spike every 30 years.
Quick follow-up, every 30 years, when is that 30-year peak?
It varies even by district based on communities and how people move in and out as people age out of those. For instance, my community is in the low part where people are aging out and people that are young kids like myself are moving into the communities. And so that varies. It's all on how the population growth occurred in that community. Every community grew differently, especially as you think about the population creep from in Metro West from the city. So every community is very different, where some communities are seeing growth, some are seeing decline right now.
The data is pretty interesting. There's less children as you go through. If you take a look at it, it's what it's.
Kurt, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to get into the weeds, but that, I know it says last 5 years.
No,
Mr. Eckel, can you repeat your question?
Sure. You talking about these 30-year cycles?
Yeah.
Can you generally characterize, are all the towns a similar cycle on like this? On the
Yeah, so I think Mr. Eckel is pointing me back to a question about what we see in enrollment trends with our students in our 3 towns, because we have seen a decline in enrollment. And if you followed the ball as I was presenting to FinCom's Budget and Warrant Committee, our school committee, throughout the winter this year on how we come to fund the school district, you will have seen in those presentations that we've actually had some declining enrollment, particularly in the town of Stowe relative to the other 2 towns that have remained flat over the last sort of 5 to 6 year period. So we watch those trends, and basically, you know, I'm not an analyst, I can just look at the numbers. You can look at homes have not turned over in our towns in the last few years. People have been staying in their homes. We see that, and that's part of what's made real estate prices drive up. So as a result, the number of school-aged children has declined because people haven't sold their homes to people like Craig's family to then regenerate and bring more kids back into the system. So I wouldn't say it's a steep decline. There's been a moderate decline there, but I do have some presentation materials on that.
Yeah, and just to kind of qualify my statement, I was referring more to a national statistic. I do not know the local ones to work with.
I can also tell you that in terms of enrollment in the public schools in Massachusetts, as I shared with our school committee this past week, the entire state is down. Has been down over the last 4 years. And the delta in our community is reflective of that percentage decrease across the state.
And we could have a whole public forum on why that happens too.
Did I hear correctly that when considering other sites outside of Bolton would also be considered?
Yes, we're required to study multiple sites. We also have to take into consideration what the regional agreement is. I know typically when you build a school, you want it to be in a central location, but if there's a property available that we're aware of, we can study it and see if it's even an appropriate site. And we can, you know, address that first and then address the regional agreement second.
We're in that process now.
Yeah, does the renovation option, is that just addressing all of the items that are out of compliance with the current code, or is that?
The repair option is just bring it up to code. The question was, does the renovation option only repair the building? The answer said the repair option only repairs and brings up to code. It doesn't address any of the educational plan. The renovation option repairs and brings up to code, but also addresses the educational plan.
When the project gets to a vote, what happens? Does all 3 towns have to agree? And if they don't agree, what's the process at that point?
I would turn this over to the
Is there council here tonight?
I think that if one of the towns doesn't approve this, you're not getting into high school. So,
That happened 10 years ago.
yeah. But on that point, and I'm not just a pretty face, I can say it. One of the things that I did want to address before this forum concludes, I just want to give the audience here a little bit of an understanding of how this, our building committee and our district committee operate in regards to this project. So for those of you who don't know, we have 21 members on our building committee. Of that 21, we have 15 what we call voting members. The additional members are what we call our advisory members. The 15 voting members are predominantly residents of the district, the only exception being our superintendent, who has a voting position on the committee. So all the decisions at the building committee level are being addressed and voted on by residents of the district. In addition to that, the building committee serves as a subcommittee of our district committee. And ultimately, all decisions made with regards to this build project vest with the district committee and your 11 elected representatives, who will then eventually take this matter before all the voters of the district. So at the end of the day, this project is really in your hands, more so than the building committee and the district committee. And just to spin off of some of this discussion we had relative to this capacity of this, the number that 925 is the building capacity. That was the number that was given to us by the MassSBA. And as Mr. Olson and Superintendent Downey has astutely pointed out, that at the end of the day, ultimately, how big a project, how big a school we build, it lies in your hands. If the three communities are willing to fund for additional space, we can do that, but it really rests with the voters of the district. Thank you.
All right. Well, I don't think we see any more questions.
So with that, I want to thank our team for coming in tonight and giving us presentation. Thank you, Lieutenant Gleason, for chairing our committee. Thank you, everyone. We're going to be having more of these forums. I would encourage you to come again and bring a neighbor so we can continue to grow the education of this project as we move on. So thank you for coming out tonight.
Your questions are important. Your feedback is important because, as Attorney Gleason mentioned, this is your community's building, and we're only as good as what you tell us.
Thank you, everyone.